Welcome back to ABA Chapter Chat. We often talk about individual behavior, but have you ever stopped to think about how much our actions are influenced by the groups we're a part of? Today we're going to unpack the idea of group control and see just how powerful this force can be in shaping what we do.
It's like an invisible hand guiding our choices. We might not always realize it, but the groups we belong to, from our families to our workplaces to society as a whole, are constantly influencing us through a complex system of rewards and consequences.
It's like a giant web of social feedback, right? Our source material for this deep dive actually uses the analogy of a tug of war to describe group control. Instead of a rope, it's our behaviors that are being pulled back and forth, depending on what the group deems good or bad.
Exactly, and those classifications of good and bad aren't always based on some universal moral code. It's really about how our actions impact the other members of the group. If what we're doing is seen as beneficial or reinforcing to the group, it's generally going to be labeled as good. But if our actions create problems or have negative consequences for others, that's when the group is likely to label them as bad.
So it's all relative to the specific group and its dynamics.
Absolutely. What might be considered perfectly acceptable behavior in one group could be completely taboo in another. Think about something as simple as expressing your emotions. In some families, it's encouraged to be open and talk about your feelings, while in other families, showing too much emotion might be seen as a sign of weakness.
That's a great example. It really highlights how the same behavior can be interpreted so differently depending on the group context.
And here's where it gets even more interesting. Sometimes these classifications of good and bad can actually be flawed or outdated, based on how the group itself is structured or the power dynamics within that group.
You mean like situations where a certain behavior might benefit a select few within the group, but not the majority?
Precisely. Think about a workplace where gossiping is rampant. For those who engage in it, gossiping might be reinforcing because it gives them a sense of power or belonging. But for those who are the target of gossip, it can be incredibly damaging. And if the people in positions of authority either participate in or condone the gossip, it creates a situation where a bad behavior is actually being reinforced.
That's such an important point, especially for us as ABA professionals. If we're working with a client in a group setting, we need to be aware of these potentially harmful dynamics. We can't just assume that what the group labels as good or bad is actually in the best interests of everyone involved. Sometimes we might need to help our clients navigate those complex situations and advocate for their own needs.
Absolutely. And that's where our understanding of how groups use reinforcement and punishment to shape behavior becomes really crucial. We need to be able to identify those subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways that groups exert control.
So let's talk about the tools of the trade, so to speak. How do groups actually use reinforcement and punishment to keep individuals in line? I mean, it's not like there's a rule book they hand out, right?
Right. It's often more implicit than explicit. But the basic principles are the same as we see in individual behavior change. When someone does something the group considers good, they're likely to be rewarded in some way. It could be something as simple as verbal praise or a pat on the back, or it could be something more tangible like a promotion or a special privilege.
And those rewards, no matter how small, reinforce that good behavior and make the person more likely to repeat it in the future. It's like shaping behavior through positive reinforcement.
Exactly. And on the flip side, when someone does something the group deems bad, they're often met with some form of punishment. It could be a reprimand, a fine, social isolation, or even something more severe depending on the severity of the transgression and the norms of the group.
And the idea is that by associating the bad behavior with a negative consequence, the person will be less likely to do it again.
Right, and this is where the emotional component comes into play. We've all experienced that feeling of shame when we do something that goes against the expectations of our group. That feeling of shame is a powerful motivator to avoid repeating those actions in the future.
It's like our own internal system of self-control, but it's heavily influenced by the reactions of the group.
It is, and that brings us to a really interesting concept our source material highlights. Self-control as a learned behavior that's actually reinforced by the group. Think about it. When we learn to regulate our own behavior in a way that aligns with the group's expectations, we're essentially avoiding future punishment.
That's fascinating. So it's not just about the group directly controlling us. They're also teaching us to control ourselves in a way that benefits the group.
Exactly. It's like a self-perpetuating cycle. The group sets the standards of behavior, reinforces those who comply, and punishes those who don't. Over time, individuals learn to internalize those standards and regulate their own behavior accordingly, even in the absence of direct group oversight.
So the group's influence extends far beyond those immediate interactions. It shapes our internal compass, so to speak. But this makes me wonder, Why do groups go through all this trouble to control individual behavior?
That's a great question, and it's something our source really dives into. It's not just about control for control's sake. There are actually some very compelling reasons why groups exert this influence over individuals. And those reasons can vary depending on the group, the context, and the specific behaviors involved.
So it's not always about some nefarious agenda.
Right. Sometimes it's about genuine care and a desire to see others thrive within the group. For example, think about a family reinforcing good table manners in their children. It's not just about keeping things tidy and avoiding embarrassment. It's also about teaching those children social skills that will benefit them in the long run.
It's about setting them up for success in future social situations, making them feel comfortable and confident when they're interacting with others.
Exactly. And when it comes to punishing bad behavior, it's not always driven by anger or malice. Sometimes it's motivated by a natural instinct to protect the group from harm. For instance, a community might implement strict rules against stealing to ensure the safety and well-being of its members.
It's about maintaining a sense of order and security within the group, so everyone feels safe and protected.
Right. It's fascinating to see how both reinforcement and punishment can actually be taught by the group itself. This means that individuals can learn to control others, even when they're not personally affected by the behavior in question.
So it becomes less about personal gain or revenge and more about upholding the group's norms, even if it means going against our own individual desires.
Precisely. And this really highlights the powerful influence of social learning. We observe how others in our group respond to certain behaviors, and we internalize those reactions. Over time, we become agents of group control ourselves, reinforcing the good and punishing the bad, even when it doesn't directly impact us.
It's like this invisible web of social influence that keeps the group functioning in a particular way. But if we're constantly conforming to group expectations, doesn't that come at a cost to the individual?
That's an important point to consider. And our source doesn't shy away from it. Group control, despite its benefits, often involves some level of sacrifice for the individual. We might have to suppress our own desires, even if they're perfectly natural, in order to avoid punishment or maintain our standing within the group.
For instance, sharing our toys even though we'd rather keep playing with them, or biting our tongues when we really want to speak our minds.
Exactly, those are small-scale examples, but it can extend to much bigger life decisions. We might choose a career path that our family approves of, even if it's not our true passion. Or we might stay silent on a social issue because speaking out could jeopardize our relationships within a particular group.
It's almost like there's this constant negotiation happening between our individual needs and the demands of the group.
There is, and the source really underscores how important it is to acknowledge that tension, especially in fields like ABA, where we're trying to help individuals thrive within their social contexts. We can't just focus on changing individual behavior in isolation. We need to understand the powerful influence of the group and find ways to help our clients navigate those dynamics effectively.
This makes me think about how often we as ABA professionals talk about the importance of individualization. But how can we truly individualize our interventions if we're not taking into account the powerful influence of the groups our clients belong to?
That's a really insightful question, and it's something we need to be grappling with constantly. We can't just assume that a behavior plan that works for one client will work for another. Even if they have similar diagnoses or challenges, the group context can make a world of difference.
This deep dive is really making me rethink how I approach my work. It's so easy to get caught up in the individual behaviors we're targeting, but it's crucial to zoom out and see the bigger picture.
Right. We need to be aware of those group dynamics, both the positive and the negative, and use our knowledge to help our clients find that sweet spot where they can meet their own needs while also functioning effectively within their social groups.
So how do we do that? How do we balance individual needs with the demands of the group, especially when those demands might not always be in the best interests of the individual?
It's a constant balancing act. And there's no one-size-fits-all answer. But I think one of the most important things we can do as ABA professionals is to help our clients develop strong self-advocacy skills.
So giving them the tools to communicate their needs, set boundaries, and negotiate those complex social situations.
Exactly, because even though the group exerts a powerful influence, individuals are not powerless. We can make choices, we can speak up, and we can advocate for ourselves. And the more we understand how group control works, the more empowered we are to navigate those dynamics effectively.
That's a really empowering message. It's not about rejecting group influence altogether, but about understanding how it works so we can make conscious choices about how much we conform and when it's important to stand our ground.
Exactly. And our source makes a really interesting point about how the power of the group, while immense, isn't always consistent or efficient.
Oh, that's interesting. Why not? I mean, you'd think with all those rewards and punishments, groups would be pretty good at getting what they want.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But the reality is, groups are made up of individuals, and individuals are complex creatures with their own motivations, biases, and inconsistencies.
So it's not some perfectly orchestrated system. It's more like a messy, dynamic process with lots of moving parts.
Exactly. And one of the reasons group control isn't always consistent is because those classifications of good and bad aren't always clear-cut. There can be disagreements within the group about what behaviors are acceptable or unacceptable.
Like one person's bad behavior might be another person's quirky personality trait.
Right. And even when there's a general consensus about what's considered good or bad, the group might not always act in a unified way to reinforce or punish those behaviors.
So there might be some members who are more strict about enforcing the rules, while others are more lenient.
Exactly. And that inconsistency can create confusion and mixed messages for individuals within the group.
It's almost like the group itself is struggling to figure out what it wants and how to achieve it.
You could say that, and this highlights the importance of observation and analysis for ABA professionals working in group settings. We can't just assume we understand the dynamics at play. We need to carefully observe how the group responds to different behaviors, identify inconsistencies in reinforcement and punishment, and then use that information to tailor our interventions accordingly.
So instead of imposing our own ideas about what's good or bad, we need to understand the group's own internal logic, even if it seems messy or illogical from the outside.
Exactly. It's about meeting the group where they're at and understanding their unique system of rewards and consequences.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening. It's clear that group control is a powerful force, but it's also a lot more complex than I initially realized. It really makes you realize that there's so much happening beneath the surface when it comes to human behavior. It's not just about what we do as individuals. It's about how those actions fit into the larger tapestry of the groups we belong to.
It's like that saying, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Groups have this emergent quality where the interactions between individuals create something new and complex that goes beyond any single person's intentions.
And as ABA professionals, we need to be attuned to those emergent properties of groups if we want to truly understand and influence behavior.
Right. It's not enough to just focus on individual behavior plans. We need to be thinking about how our interventions impact the group dynamics and vice versa.
You know, as we're wrapping up this deep dive, I keep coming back to this idea that group control often works to the temporary disadvantage of the individual. It seems paradoxical, but it makes sense when you think about all the subtle pressures we face to conform.
It speaks to the fundamental trade-off we often make as social beings. We sacrifice some degree of individual freedom in exchange for the benefits of belonging to a group. And those benefits can be substantial: safety, security, cooperation, shared resources, and even just the feeling of connection and belonging.
It's like we're constantly weighing the costs and benefits of going along with the group versus asserting our own needs and desires.
Exactly. And as ABA professionals, we need to be sensitive to that delicate balance. We don't want to encourage blind conformity, but we also recognize that being part of a group can be incredibly enriching and supportive for individuals.
So how do we help our clients find that sweet spot? How do we empower them to be true to themselves while also navigating those complex group dynamics effectively?
I think it starts with fostering self-awareness, helping our clients understand how groups influence their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Once they have that awareness, they can start to make more conscious choices about when to conform, when to assert themselves, and when to seek support.
So giving them the tools to analyze those group dynamics and make informed decisions about how they want to engage.
Exactly. And it's not just about understanding the group's influence. It's also about understanding their own individual strengths and needs. What are their values? What are their goals? What are their non-negotiables?
Helping them develop that strong sense of self so they can confidently navigate those social situations without losing sight of who they are.
Right. It's about empowering them to be active participants in shaping their own social experiences, rather than just passive recipients of group influence.
This deep dive has been incredibly thought-provoking. It's really shifted my perspective on how I view behavior change. It's not just about the individual, it's about the individual within their social ecosystem.
I agree. And I think this understanding of group control has profound implications for how we approach everything, from therapy to education to social justice. If we want to create more inclusive and equitable environments, we need to be mindful of how groups can both empower and marginalize individuals.
It's a powerful reminder that behavior change doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens within a complex web of social relationships and influences.
And as ABA professionals, we have a responsibility to use our knowledge and skills to help individuals navigate those complexities effectively and ethically.
Listeners, as you head back out into your own social worlds, take a moment to observe the dynamics at play within the groups you belong to. Think about how those groups influence your behavior and the behavior of those around you. And most importantly, consider how you can use your understanding of ABA to promote positive change within those groups, fostering environments where individuals feel supported, empowered, and valued.
That's a fantastic takeaway. And remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation. There's so much more to explore about group dynamics and their impact on human behavior. So keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep using your knowledge to make a difference.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into group control. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic from the world of ABA. Until then, keep learning and keep growing.